Well, welcome everyone. I'm honored to be here. My name's Huey Sandfort, and like Miss Carolyn said, I grew up on the B.B. Brooks Ranch. No, not the one north, the one at the end of Casper Mountain. And I had the opportunity to have some of the most amazing adventures out there that anyone could ever have, and I'm going to share one of those with you now. Let me set this up for you. It's the end of October 1982. We had dehorned cattle the weekend before, and by that I mean the ranch ran Hereford cattle, and they had horns, and you have to take those off for several reasons that I won't even get into, but you got to take them off. So we did that, and we usually waited till around the 15th, the 20th. Usually by then there was enough frost that we didn't have flies anymore to infect or get into the open wounds on the calves. The day before this incident took place, it was one of those fall days that you kind of live for, and that in years past you reflect on that it was like the perfect day. And let me tell you some of the characters that were there with me. One of my dearest friends, Leonard Carter, he was about 25 years old, probably one of the finest cowboys I ever met. He was the resident cowboy up there on the mountain. And where we were was, if you go to the end of the Hat 6 Road and you go up on top of the mountain, that's called Deer Creek Park. And Deer Creek Park is an open area of meadows and two mountain ranges. It's between two mountain ranges, and Deer Creek runs through there, and the West Fork of Deer Creek, which comes in from the west end. And the whole park area is probably about 8.5, 9 miles long. And the B.B. Brooks Ranch cow camp sits to the west of where the main road goes. And that particular day, Leonard was there, the cowboy, myself, Dr. Robert Schur. He was an emergency room doc, and I'll talk to you about him in a minute. And my good friend Bob Scheer. Bob Scheer was a private pilot. He flew for the True Company, and at the time that this took place, he was a life flight pilot out of Denver. And we had harvested our deer and the day before, and so we were just kind of sitting around camp enjoying things. Bob, the pilot, had to leave because he had to go on duty the following morning in Denver. And so he left about 1:30, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and about 4 o'clock, here he come in his airplane. He had a twin-engine Cessna that he owned himself, and he buzzed the cow camp a couple of times and waggled his wings, and away he went. So that left Dr. Schur, myself, and Leonard. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Schur. When I was a policeman, I spent a lot of time at the emergency room with everything from gunshot wounds to stab wounds to car accidents, and I got to know Bob really, really well. And he's passed away now. One of the things I will tell you is, if you were seriously hurt, I mean like life-threatening hurt, if anybody could save your life, it was Dr. Schur. He graduated second in his class at Stanford, so you have to kind of figure out that he was pretty smart. One of the things that Dr. Schur did, I'll share with you. I was at the emergency room about 2 o'clock one morning, and Bob was on duty, and we were having coffee, which we did a lot. Several of the policemen would go up there at night if it was quiet, and we'd share stories, and we did the same thing. We tried to save people's lives. And they brought a man in that was like 40 years old, and his heart had stopped. And they were doing CPR on him, and this, you got to remember, this is the time before those defibrillators and things like that. I think they came several years after that. Well, the crew in the emergency room did everything for this guy. They intubated him and were breathing for him, and there was no response, and of course they hooked him to everything and the monitors and all that, and they couldn't get his heart going. And I cannot remember why his heart stopped. But this is what I saw Bob do. Bob said, give me some betadine sponges. And betadine is this kind of nasty looking brownish red stuff, and they wipe your body down with it and it kills the germs, or it's supposed to. And so he scrubbed the left side of this man, and he told the head nurse, he said, roll him over on his right side. And he said, get me a big blade. And he called it by name. Scalpels and stuff like that, I guess, have names or numbers and everything. Nancy might know. He had a blade that was about 2 inches long and everything. He took this guy and just slit him open right there. Stuck his hand in there and started massaging his heart. And about a minute later on the monitor, it started to work again. A week later, that man about a week and a half later, the man walked out of there. They took him up to surgery to do all the stuff they needed to do to suture this up. The surgeons did and everything. I'll never forget, everybody was standing there kind of just struck when he did that. And when he got done and everything, he pulled his gloves off and he told the head nurse, he said, please don't bring any more of those in. Not tonight. So anyway, Bob Shearer, the pilot, left and he flew by, as I said. And Bob, the doctor, and myself and Leonard were there, and we were enjoying the afternoon with the idea that we were going to leave the next morning. Bob and I were going to leave the next morning, and Leonard's idea was he was going to stay as long as he could and keep the cows up there. They were in the last pasture before they brought them off the mountain. And if you've ever been around ranching, especially up in that country, usually about the 1st of November, they bring the cattle off the mountain, they wean the calves off of them, take the calves off of them, and they preg test them to see if they're pregnant. And then they usually move them, to where the cattle will winter. So we had dinner, and we went to bed about 9 o'clock. It was a beautiful day. There was no wind, not a cloud in the sky. We got up at 7 o'clock in the morning and there was 2 feet of snow on the ground. And it was snowing hard. It was snowing really hard. Leonard says, I'm going to get a cup of coffee. I'm going to saddle a horse and I'm going to ride up here and open this last gate so that the cows can start off. And that gate, I know it very well. I know that part of the ranch like the back of my hand. If you open that gate, the cows trail up the side of the mountain and they're over the top of the mountain and they end up down in Smith Creek. If any of you know where Smith Creek is, that's where they end up. So Leonard got on a horse and he rode up there, and when he got back, he said, we need to go up West Fork and open gates in case there's cattle still up there that haven't come down or that we missed when we were rounding up. And that happened quite often. You'd have, 10 head. And of course the bulls were still up there. And so Bob said, you know what? I've chained up my pickup because I knew we were going to need chains. How many people in this room have chained up a vehicle to get in and out of someplace? Anybody? Oh yeah. Remember to do it before you end up in the mud. Anyway, so Bob and I had chained up his big pickup. He had a big Ford pickup. And Bob said, Leonard, get in the truck and we'll go up there and we'll take a look and we can open the gates and you don't have to be out there in the cold and the snow. So we took off, and in that particular day, we went south and then to the west. And we opened a couple of gates, and I said, you know what? Let's run up to this place called Zentner Meadows. There used to be a cabin up in there. The homesteaders, their name was Zentner. And then the Kelseys had it after that. So we drive up there, and this pickup is just about to push snow with the front bumper. That's how deep it was, and it was still snowing hard. So we pull in there by the Zentner cabin, and I happened to look out of the window of the truck, and there was a set of tracks. And I told Bob, I said, Bob, stop, I want to look at these tracks. because I didn't know if they were cows or elk or what. So I get out of the car, or out of the truck, and the snow was so deep you couldn't really tell what they were. So I followed them, and there was a big pine tree, like a spruce pine tree. And underneath that pine tree, I could see the tracks a little better. The tracks were made by a person. So I walked over, I followed the tracks, but the wind had kind of filled them in and everything. And I was just about ready to turn and go back to the truck because it was cold and windy and snowy. And the hair raised up on the back of my neck. And I said, there's something. So I called out, I said, hey, is there anybody out there? Nothing. And I called again, nothing. And I started to turn to go back to the truck. Now the truck's still running, it's making noise. And I hear this sound. And it was one of those that you think you heard it, but you're not really sure. So I started walking over and I picked up the tracks again, and they were up against the old homestead, and it was an old log cabin. And there was a door laying there, partially buried, and I hear this voice, help me. Went over there, rolled the door over, and there's a 17-year-old boy underneath that door in the fetal position. So I motioned to Bob, and he jumped out of the truck and come over, and he couldn't move, this kid couldn't move. We got him up and took him over to the truck. Leonard was out by then, and Bob said, we got to take all of his clothes off right now. So here's 3 grown men stripping a 17-year-old boy down to his birthday suit. And we got him stripped down. He was suffering so bad from hypothermia. So we got him in the truck. We turned it around. Leonard got in the back, and we headed back toward the Brooks Scout Camp. And Bob was trying to figure out what he was going to do. And when we got down there, we thought about coffee and things like that. And Bob said, no, we got to get him to town now. So Leonard stayed, and he was moving cows, and Bob and I left to come off the mountain. And we had a hell of a time getting off. It was drifted, and we lost the road several times, and we had put this boy in a sleeping bag, and we're trying to figure out how bad he was, and Bob kept checking him and checking his carotid artery to make sure that he was still doing all right. He kept saying, one thing he kept telling us was, there's a crashed airplane up there. And he said it about a dozen times, but he didn't say much else. He couldn't even tell us his name, you guys. That's how hypothermic he was. But there was some kind of an alarm that set off in his brain about this airplane. So we finally got off the mountain, and that was probably about noon, I would say noon or 1 o'clock. We ended up shoveling and all that to get the truck out. In fact, we ended up winching one time. Bob had a big winch on the front of that truck, and we ended up winching out. But we got down. Bob says, I'm going to stay with him. I got under the truck and took the chains off and threw them in the back of the truck, and we headed for town. You got to remember, in 1982, we didn't have life flight. We didn't have cell phones. We didn't have GPS, or we didn't have those new monitors that they have now that come off of a satellite. If you push the button, they know exactly where you are, and it's a sign, it's an emergency signal. So we get this young man to the hospital, and he didn't weigh that much, probably 120 pounds, and I was pretty strong at the time. And I carried him into the emergency room, and we got him on a gurney and all that, and took the sleeping bag off and got warm blankets for him. And what they did is they took a tube and went down into his stomach, and then one into his nose, and they started irrigating his stomach with warm water to warm him up. Because obviously your stomach is surrounded by blood vessels, and that's the easiest way to get heat into your body. And about 2 days later, the boy went home, and they'd been looking for him. So where this all started is out in Shirley Basin. His family was camping out there and deer hunting, And he walked away that morning about 8 o'clock. So he'd been gone for basically 24 hours. And all he had on was a pair of Levi's, a pair of cowboy boots, a felt shirt or a wool shirt, and a hat. And he had a gun, a knife, and a belt. But when we found him, he didn't have any of that. And I blame that on hypothermia. He probably just took all that off or just laid it down and walked away. But we ended up, the sheriff's department contacted his family, and they ended up coming up there. I didn't really get a chance to meet them because I went back up on the mountain. And about the airplane, so shortly after that, Bill Estes called me. He was the sheriff. And he said, "Huey, tell me about this airplane." And I explained to him what this young man had said. And he said, "Well," he said, "I'm going to borrow Mr. True's helicopter and let's go up there. You know that country, why don't you go with me?" So we flew up there and we flew all over and we couldn't find it. Well, what we finally determined, you guys, and you may have heard this story, I think it was in 1954, there were 3 bankers and a pilot that were flying out of Denver going to Cody in a small airplane, a single engine airplane, and they crashed up there in those mountains, and they all died. Well, they wanted to find the airplane really bad because they wanted to find the passengers, but from what I understand, that airplane was carrying $4 million worth of bearer bonds. Yeah, and a sheep herder stumbled onto it a couple of years later, and that's how they recovered the bodies and all that. So that's how we ended up with that story. One of the things about Deer Creek Park that we talk about, and I see Nancy sitting at her husband grew up there, and he knows the park just like I do. If you ever have a chance to go to Deer Creek Park, you better be prepared for anything. There's a saying, there's Casper weather and there's Deer Creek Park weather. And never mistake the two for one for the other. Because when we got off the mountain, there was probably an inch of snow on the Hat 6 Road, and yet there was 2 feet of snow up there, and it was snowing hard when we left. I never did find out who that boy was. I sure would like to have talked to him or seen him. He'd probably be in his 40s now. I would love to have talked to him to see what his life turned out, because the events that happened that morning were nothing short of divine intervention. We weren't even going to go there. And then to go the direction that we did, and to find those tracks, and for me to not give up on something that bothered me, that I just had this feeling that there was something, that young man would have died. Bob said he only had about 15 minutes and we couldn't have recovered him. And how long would it have been if we hadn't found him and he hadn't made that sound? How many years would it have been before we found his skeleton up there? You know? It's just amazing. I think about it all the time. I'm just grateful that I was there to help to save this young man. So anyway, that's my adventure. One of my adventures. Do any of you have any questions? Okay.